Hello, and welcome to your annual training module on the use of seclusion and restraint in the school setting. My name is Kevin Sutton. I'm chair of the Education Practice Group at the Miller Johnson Law Firm, and I have the pleasure of walking you through this year's training module. First, we're going to think about the legal foundations and the concept of prohibitions on seclusion and restraint have been in place for some time now. In the early 2000s, the Michigan Department of Education State Board of Education adopted guidance on supporting student behavior that talked about the use of seclusion and restraint. That guidance was codified into law by the state of Michigan in 2016 when they adopted new laws restricting the use of seclusion and restraint in schools. These prohibitions are outlined in the Michigan Revised School Code, and all school districts within the state of Michigan are required to maintain policies that align with those state guidelines. What's important to think about is why. Why do we have the law? Why do we have the guidelines that are put into place? And from a big picture perspective, the seclusion and restraint restrictions are intended to promote the care, safety, and welfare, as well as the security of the school community and each and every pupil that enters our schools. Ultimately, they are encouraging the use of proactive, evidence-based strategies to reduce challenging student behaviors with the goal of eliminating the use of seclusion and restraint. More than anything, the guidelines are there to ensure that seclusion and restraint are only used as a last resort, as we will talk about in great detail. The law gives us specific definitions for what constitutes seclusion and what constitutes restraint. And you see the definitions there. Seclusion is the confinement of a pupil in a room or other space from which the pupil is physically prevented from leaving. And restraint means an action that prevents or significantly restricts a pupil's movement. There are generally three types of restraint: physical restraint, chemical restraint, and mechanical restraint. In the K-12 setting, we typically see physical restraint as the primary apparatus of restraint, though mechanical restraint does come into play at times. Chemical restraint you see much less often, but ultimately all are prohibited by law in the state of Michigan. Ultimately, the state has given us a list of prohibited practices as it relates to integrating physically with students. And we know that corporal punishment is banned. We're not allowed to deprive students of their basic needs. Certainly, we know no staff member is allowed to engage in child abuse. On that list, you see there seclusion or physical restraint other than emergency situations. And we're going to talk about what those emergency situations look like and what the restrictions are in those contexts. Uh, Staff are prohibited from the intentional application of any noxious substance or stimulus to a student. And then you see references to restraint, mechanical, chemical restraint, or any restraint that might inhibit breathing of a student. And then prone restraint or any other type or restraint in that form. So ultimately, you have a long list of things that are prohibited by state law, including seclusion and restraint in its various forms, as we will break down. From an oversimplified lens, thinking about this in terms of a one slide that says it all, we can say that seclusion and restraint are strictly prohibited as a regular practice. What the law makes clear, what the guidance makes clear, is that we cannot engage in actions of seclusion and restraint as a matter of convenience. We can't do those things because we're frustrated. We can't do those things because perhaps a student is having a very bad day. I know that sounds like tremendous common sense, but ultimately that's what the law is telling us. This is not something that can be regularly integrated into our practices or into the manner in which we address student behavior. The law does tell us, and we've seen that word emergency, that emergency seclusion and restraint is permitted, but only in emergency situations and with significant limitations. Again, we will break down what that looks like. And sometimes this creates confusion that seclusion and restraint generally can't be used, but it can be used in emergency situations. And I think what we'll see here as we move through the other slides is that emergency is really means emergency. That it is a last resort, situations when there are significant safety concerns and we feel that there is no choice but to seclude or restrain a student, as we will discuss. So first, we're going to look at those situations relative to seclusion that we believe might rise to the level of an emergency. And what the state statutory definition is that an emergency seclusion is a last resort emergency safety intervention involving seclusion that is necessitated by an ongoing emergency situation and that provides an opportunity for the pupil to regain self-control while maintaining the safety of the pupil and others. What's interesting about that definition is that you see the word emergency twice. You also see the phrase last resort. And I think that's very intentional in terms of how the legislature defined emergency seclusion, is that they want to make it abundantly clear that this is not something that should be happening in the normal course. This should only be happening in really extraordinary situations and only as a last resort. If we find ourselves in a situation that we believe meets that definition, and the student is secluded, the law requires continuous observation of the student, which is to mean we can't simply put them in a room and walk away. They have to be monitored at all times, and whatever room or area they are placed in has to meet certain safety standards, and you see references there. There has to be adequate ventilation, lighting. The room can't be locked, meaning the student could leave the room if need be. And again, we're thinking about these emergency situations where we feel compelled to seclude a student. Those necessary safety steps must be included as well. Very importantly, even if we think we have a situation that arises to the level of an emergency that would warrant seclusion, we are not allowed to emergency seclude in the case of preschoolers, students who we believe to be self-injurious or suicidal. We certainly can't do so for convenience or discipline purposes. We cannot do so as a substitute for an educational program or when there are other less restrictive alternatives available. We know that we've looked at the prohibited practices already, and we certainly can't seclude when it's contradicted or contraindicated by health or disability of a student. And so you see when we talked about only allowed in emergency situations with significant limitations, these are the limitations that we're discussing. If a situation, again, that you believe rises to a level of emergency seclusion arises, we have to be safe, appropriate, and proportionate in how we handle the situation. Probably the number one thing to remember is that if we have a situation that you believe rises to an emergency level, we're going to have to contact key identified personnel. And that is a term of art. That is not just three words linked together. Key identified personnel in the building are aware of who they are. They have been specifically trained and specifically identified in terms of responding to these situations which rise to an emergency level and need to be responded to with subject matter knowledge, training, etc. So if you have a situation, again, that you believe rises to an emergency level, contacting key identified personnel is going to be one of the very first things you need to do. You see their reference to the time and duration requirements. So if we have an emergency, we are not allowed to seclude the student for any longer than is necessary for the emergency situation to end. And as a general guideline, you see not longer than 15 minutes of seclusion for an elementary student or 20 minutes for a middle school or high school pupil. If we get into looking at those times and assessing how long a student has been secluded, I would certainly expect that by that moment, the key identified personnel have responded and will be able to engage with the student and help monitor the situation. If we need to go beyond those general time requirements, we're going to need to have additional support from staff. We'll need to have documentation to explain why we're doing it, so on and so forth. So you see there over the course of 3 slides relative to seclusion, multiple references to emergency, multiple references to limitation, references to bring in the key identified personnel who are going to help us navigate that situation. Clear indication from the legislature that they want this, again, used only in the most extraordinary circumstances and with significant limitations. We turn now then to physical restraint and emergency physical restraint. And you're going to see definitions and terms that look a lot similar to what we talked about relative to seclusion. So, emergency physical restraint is a last resort emergency safety intervention involving physical restraint that is necessitated by an ongoing emergency situation that provides an opportunity for the pupil to regain self-control while maintaining the safety of the pupil and others. So just like that seclusion definition, we see the word emergency twice. We talk about student regaining self-control, and going on only as long as that emergency situation exists. As well, we have limitations on even if we think we have an emergency, we cannot use emergency physical restraint in the following situations. Certainly for convenience or disciplinary purposes, as a substitute for an educational program or a less restrictive alternative. We've looked at that list of prohibited practices as well. And again, if it's contraindicated by health or disability, physical restraint is not going to be an option. Once again, if we're going to engage in emergency physical restraint of a student, we have to do so in a manner that is safe, appropriate, and proportionate. Yet again, we need to make sure that we are immediately contacting key identified personnel so they can respond to the situation and help us navigate with their specific training and knowledge how best to support the student if they are in an escalated state. Like seclusion, there are time and duration limitations on an emergency physical restraint. Generally not any longer than is necessary for the emergency situation to end, and generally no longer than 10 minutes. Once again, if we're going to go beyond that stated time requirement, we're going to need additional staff support and documentation to explain why we're doing that. You'll note that the time limitation for physical restraint is less than both of the time limitations we saw for seclusion. And conceptually, that makes sense, right? If we're talking about physically restraining a student, certainly we only want to do that in emergency situations, but that those minutes are going to pass and they're going to seem a lot longer than simply if a student is secluded in a separate space. And so you note the legislature making that time limit much lower in terms of restraint. It's something we want to be mindful of. So again, both of these scenarios, emergencies only, responding to exigent circumstances where there are safety concerns and contacting key identified personnel within the building in both circumstances. If we find ourselves in the circumstance in which we have to use emergency seclusion or emergency restraint, we are going to be required to document and report. This is non-negotiable and it's a very important component of these situations if we have to use them. So for each use, the use must be documented in writing and reported in writing and orally, both to administration and to the parents or guardian immediately. And so how that works and what that looks like will obviously be guided by building administration, but building administration is going to need to know that it's happened and they're going to need to know in real time that the situation has occurred of an emergency seclusion or an emergency restraint. There is an obligation, as noted there, to contact the parent or guardians and to do so promptly. Whether that call gets handled by administration or by staff in the room will ultimately be part of a discussion with the administrator. Typically, that call comes from administration, but that is not legally required. That's something that you'll need to work out with building administration. You see the timeline there. It's got to happen very quickly, very contemporaneously, and there needs to be a debriefing as well with the parents and the pupil. You note it says must make reasonable effort. Sometimes the parents don't want to participate in a debriefing, but we certainly need to offer that. Again, those are all contacts and engagements with family that you can navigate through administration and or the key identified personnel who have responded. If we have a situation where we have a pupil who exhibits a pattern of behavior that necessitates emergency intervention. So we've had to maybe emergency seclude more than once or have an emergency physical restraint more than once. If we see this pattern start to develop, we are required to develop something called an emergency intervention plan. This is something that will be developed both with input from parents as well as trained staff, including generally that key identified personnel. If we have a student who has significant needs and their behavior is such that we have to keep looking at doing something on this front, we want to make sure we have a plan for doing so. And that is what they call an emergency intervention plan or EIP. It's got to include legal limits, the procedures that we're going to follow, an assessment of the risks to the student, so on and so forth. So this is something that's really going to happen only in the most extraordinary of circumstances, where not only are we having emergency situations, but they're occurring in a pattern type manner. If we're going to engage, we certainly have to collect data on that as well. So if we are using seclusion and restraint, emergency seclusion and restraint, we are going to collect and report data. We have to report data to the MDE. That data is analyzed for training improvement, policy effectiveness. And we also have to make sure that we are training staff regularly, including watching modules like this. Ultimately, what you get here is that the state is dictating that seclusion and restraint cannot, again, be used as a regular practice. It is only to be used in exceptional circumstances. If it is used at all, we have to have debrief with the parent. We have to have documentation. We have to collect data on when we are using it. And in the case of the prior slide, if we have to use it in a pattern type way with a particular student, we're going to try to develop these emergency intervention plans. And so clearly the intent is to limit its use and to make sure that we are thoroughly documenting whenever we do. In terms of final reminders, we have PBIS strategies available to us to try to offer tiers of support for all students. And ultimately, that's what we want to try to do. We want to try to use our PBIS strategies to prevent emergencies with situations. If situations arise, know your role and your responsibilities. What are the limitations on your responses physically? Are there people that you need to contact in terms of key identified personnel? It's important not only to watch a module like this, but to talk as a team as you get into the school year and talk about what those expectations are. Talk about how you might respond if situations occur. These are not fun situations to think about or frankly talk about, but unfortunately they do arise from time to time. And so we want to make sure that we've taken the time to be thoughtful about how we'll respond in the potential outcome that they do. Ultimately, our goal is to protect student dignity and safety at all times. And I say that not just to have a bullet point on a slide, but to recognize that there are moments where student behaviors are very difficult and we find ourselves in very challenging situations. But ultimately, following these guidelines and using emergency seclusion or emergency physical restraint only in those emergency situations in a very, very limited fashion is intended to just do that, protect student dignity and safety at all times. Thank you so much for your attention. We wish you a wonderful school year. Best of luck.